In the spring of 1982, a backhoe operator named Steve Vanderjagt was clearing muck from the edge of a pond in Brevard County, Florida. The site sat roughly halfway between Cape Canaveral and Disney World, an ordinary stretch of flat, unremarkable Florida real estate being prepared for a new housing development. Vanderjagt paused to examine a pale object that had come up in his bucket. He turned it over in his hands. Two hollow eye sockets stared back at him. His first thought, in his own words, was unprintable. Beneath that ordinary Florida pond sat 168 human bodies buried deliberately in the peat, wrapped in what may be the oldest woven fabric ever found anywhere in the world, and so perfectly preserved by the chemistry of the bog that 91 of them still had intact brain tissue sitting inside their skulls, 8,000 years old, and nobody had any idea they were there. Vanderjagt stopped work immediately. The police were called. The county sheriff arrived, followed by the medical examiner, and for a brief, genuinely tense period, everyone standing at the edge of that pond believed they were looking at a crime scene. Multiple human skulls, visible in the freshly disturbed muck, bones protruding from the peat where the backhoe had torn through the surface. And here's the detail that tells you, before any laboratory result ever came back, exactly how well preserved these remains actually were. The local forensic expert, examining the bones on site that same day, initially believed he was looking at modern remains, not ancient, not archaeological, not the kind of obviously degraded, mineralized material that screams thousands of years old the moment a trained eye sees it. He looked at these bones and concluded they were recent enough to investigate as a potential homicide. That instinct was wrong by roughly 8,000 years. Think about what that specific misidentification actually reveals about the condition of this material. A trained forensic professional, someone whose entire career involved distinguishing old remains from recent ones, looked at bones that had been sitting in the ground since before the pyramids were built and genuinely could not tell they were ancient. That is not ordinary preservation. That is something the peat chemistry of this specific pond had accomplished that almost no other burial environment anywhere in the world has ever managed to replicate at this scale. Radiocarbon dating on two bones pulled directly from Vanderjagt's own backhoe bucket came back at 7,210 years and 7,320 years before present. Not hundreds of years old, not a few thousand. Over 7,000, placing these remains firmly within the early Archaic period, a stretch of Florida prehistory most researchers had extremely limited physical evidence for before this pond was ever disturbed. Now here's the decision that genuinely saved this site, and it deserves real direct attention because it very nearly went the other way entirely. Jim Swan, the developer building the Windover Farms subdivision, was co-developing the property alongside Jack Eckerd, the drugstore magnate. Swan had every financial incentive in the world to do exactly what dozens of developers before him had done in exactly this kind of situation. Cover the bones, say nothing, resume construction, let the housing lots go to market on schedule. Nobody outside that construction crew would have ever known what was sitting beneath that pond. He did not do that. Swan halted all work at the pond site entirely, voluntarily, and personally contacted the anthropology department at Florida State University to ask them what he was actually looking at and what should be done with it. That single call brought a young archaeologist named Glenn Doran to the site. Doran could tell immediately that the remains were Native American and were almost certainly far older than anything the forensic examiner had initially guessed. What he could not yet know, standing at the edge of that half-drained pond in 1982, was that he was looking at the beginning of one of the most important archaeological excavations ever conducted anywhere in North America, a project that would occupy the next several years of his career and produce findings that researchers around the world are still studying today. Doran led 3 full field seasons at the Windover site, running from 1984 through 1986. And what his team found beneath the peat was not what anyone standing at the edge of that pond in 1982 had remotely expected. This was not a random scatter of bones dumped carelessly into a swamp. It was not the aftermath of some ancient catastrophe that had swept a group of people into the water all at once. What Doran's team uncovered, body by careful body, was a genuine, organized cemetery, deliberately constructed, ritually maintained, and used continuously, burial after burial, for over 1,100 years. Think about what that time span actually means. 1,100 years of continuous use at a single burial site. That is roughly the distance in time from the fall of the Roman Empire to today, an entire millennium of a community returning to the same specific pond, performing the same specific ritual, maintaining the same specific practices, generation after generation after generation. And those practices were anything but casual. With only a couple of exceptions across the entire 168 individuals recovered, every single body had been placed in the same deliberate position. Fetal posture, lying on the left side, head pointed west, face turned toward the north. That level of consistency, maintained without meaningful variation across over 1,000 years of continuous use, is not the product of convenience or accident. It is the physical signature of a codified belief system, a set of rules about how the dead were to be treated, maintained with genuine discipline across roughly 40 generations of continuous practice. But the positioning of the body itself was only the beginning of the ritual. Each individual was carefully wrapped in woven fabric before being placed into the pond. That fabric, once properly examined and dated, would turn out to be among the oldest surviving woven textiles ever recovered anywhere in the world. Not crude, rough material hastily thrown over a body. Identifiable weave patterns, still clearly visible after 8,000 years underground, produced by people who understood textile construction well enough to create consistent, recognizable fabric. Then came the final step, and it is the one that genuinely separates this burial practice from almost anything else documented at any comparable site from this period. After the wrapped body was placed into the peat at the bottom of the pond, branches were lashed together into a tripod framework and driven into the peat directly above the burial. These wooden stakes physically pinned each body underwater, holding it permanently submerged beneath the surface, ensuring it would stay exactly where it had been placed, rather than shifting or floating free as the water level changed with the seasons. Somebody built a frame, drove it into the mud, and held their dead beneath the water with their own hands, deliberately, carefully, one body at a time for over 1,000 years. This was not a community discarding its dead. This was a community honoring them with a sustained, codified, ritually precise practice that never wavered meaningfully across the entire documented lifespan of the cemetery itself. And the chemistry of the pond itself, the same peat and water that received each carefully positioned, carefully wrapped, carefully pinned body across those 11 centuries, ended up doing something nobody involved in that ritual could possibly have intended or anticipated. Of 168 individuals recovered from that pond, 91 of them still had intact brain tissue inside their skulls. Let that number settle directly, because it is unlike anything else in the entire archaeological record at this scale. 91 preserved human brains, sitting inside the same skulls they had occupied in life, shrunken to roughly 1/3 of their original size by 8,000 years of slow, steady compression, but structurally present, physically recognizable, and in many cases still positioned exactly where they had been the day each person died. Think about what you are actually being asked to picture here. Not fossilized bone, the hard mineralized material that normally survives across these kinds of timescales. Not teeth, which are built to resist decay almost indefinitely. Brain tissue, the softest, most perishable organ in the entire human body, an organ that under normal burial conditions begins breaking down within hours of death and is typically gone entirely within weeks. 91 of them survived for 8,000 years. The preservation mechanism itself was remarkably simple once researchers understood what had actually happened. The anaerobic environment at the bottom of the peat pond, completely devoid of oxygen, combined with an unusually favorable pH balance in the water itself, had slowed bacterial decomposition to a near standstill. In effect, the pond had created a naturally sealed, chemically stable preservation chamber, one that functioned the same way a laboratory vacuum seal does, except this one had been operating continuously, without any human intervention whatsoever, for roughly 80 centuries. That combination of conditions is extraordinarily rare in nature. Peat bogs in northern Europe have produced preserved human bodies before, the famous bog bodies of Denmark and Ireland among them, but those sites typically preserve skin and soft tissue while dissolving bone. Wendover did something different. It preserved both. Skeleton and soft tissue together, inside the same individual, in the same undisturbed burial, to a degree almost no other site of any age, anywhere in the world, has ever matched at this scale. And the demographic range of those 168 burials makes the site even more scientifically significant than the preservation alone already would. This was not a warrior cemetery, holding only young men of fighting age. It was not a royal burial ground, reserved exclusively for the powerful or the privileged. The ages ranged from newborn infants to adults, estimated at over 65 years old. Both sexes were equally represented across the entire sample. That means researchers were not looking at a narrow, skewed slice of one ancient community. They were looking at the full, unfiltered picture. Men, women, children, infants, the elderly, rich and poor, if such distinctions even existed within this group. Every stage of a human life, represented directly, preserved with equal care inside the same small Florida pond. A sample that broad, that well-preserved, from a period this old, had simply never been available to science before Wendover. And inside that preserved brain tissue sat something no previous generation of researchers had ever been able to extract from material anywhere near this age. Researchers successfully extracted and sequenced DNA directly from the preserved brain tissue recovered at Wendover. That single sentence, stated plainly, represents one of the most significant technical achievements in the early history of ancient DNA research anywhere in the world. Think about what that extraction actually required. This was not modern tissue freshly preserved under controlled laboratory conditions. This was organic material that had been sitting at the bottom of a Florida pond for roughly 8,000 years, surrounded by peat, submerged in water, exposed to whatever chemical processes the bog environment had been running continuously across that entire enormous stretch of time. The fact that usable genetic material survived inside that tissue at all, let alone enough to actually sequence and analyze, pushed the boundaries of what anyone in the field believed ancient DNA extraction could realistically accomplish at the time the work was performed. And here's the detail worth sitting with directly, because it genuinely changes how you think about this site relative to everything else available to science from this period. Wendover provided one of the very first opportunities anywhere in archaeology to combine physical skeletal analysis with actual genetic data extracted from the same individuals, not skeletal data from one site compared against DNA from a completely different site hundreds of miles away. Both lines of evidence, physical and genetic, pulled from the exact same bodies, buried in the exact same pond, preserved under the exact same conditions. Before Wendover, researchers studying populations this old were almost entirely limited to what bones and teeth alone could tell them: how tall someone was, how old they were when they died, what injuries or diseases they carried, what their diet probably looked like based on wear patterns on their teeth and chemical signatures locked inside their bone structure. Wendover added an entirely different dimension to that picture. Actual genetic code extracted from actual brain tissue, belonging to actual specific individuals whose physical skeletons were sitting right there alongside the DNA results, available for direct comparison. That combination gave researchers something no site of comparable age had ever offered at this scale before: a genuinely multidimensional portrait of an ancient population built from both the physical evidence of their bodies and the genetic evidence locked inside those bodies simultaneously. The early genetic results generated considerable scientific interest and genuine debate. Initial analysis suggested genetic markers that surprised some researchers and complicated existing assumptions about the deep population history of the Americas. That debate remains active and genuinely sensitive today, and stating any single interpretation of the Wendover DNA as settled fact would not be honest to the current state of the science. What can be stated with confidence is that the successful extraction itself fundamentally changed what the field understood to be possible. Before Windover, the idea that usable DNA could survive inside soft tissue preserved for 8,000 years in a Florida pond was, at best, a hopeful theoretical possibility. After Windover, it was a demonstrated, published, peer-reviewed reality. And the genetic material was not the only thing inside that peat that forced researchers to rethink what a community this old was actually capable of producing. The woven fabric wrapping the bodies is, on its own, a genuinely extraordinary find. These textiles, carefully preserved by the same anaerobic peat chemistry that kept the brain tissue intact, represent some of the oldest surviving woven material ever recovered anywhere in the world. Not fragments so degraded they can barely be identified as fabric at all. Material with individual weave patterns still clearly visible after 8,000 years underground, produced by people whose textile skills were sophisticated enough to create consistent, recognizable, structurally sound cloth. Think about what the existence of that fabric actually tells you about the people who made it. Weaving is not a simple skill. It requires purpose-built tools. It requires processed plant fiber, prepared through multiple deliberate steps before a single thread can even be started. It requires a learned technique, passed from one person to another through direct instruction, practiced and refined across enough generations to produce material this consistent and this structurally competent. 8,000 years ago, in a stretch of Florida most people today associate with theme parks and retirement communities, someone was manufacturing woven textiles with enough skill and enough consistency that the finished product survived underground longer than the entire recorded history of Western civilization. The fabric was far from the only artifact preserved inside that peat. Bone tools came out of the pond looking so fresh, so clean, so structurally intact, that without the radiocarbon dates attached to them, a reasonable observer might genuinely assume they had been placed there within recent memory rather than 8 millennia earlier. The preservation was that complete. The peat had done its work that thoroughly. A bottle gourd was recovered from the same deposits, a cultivated plant whose presence at a site this old carries its own quiet significance for understanding how early plant use and possible cultivation practices developed among hunter-gatherer populations in the ancient Americas. Wooden stakes from the burial tripods, the frameworks that had physically held each body submerged beneath the surface, remained structurally intact after 8,000 years in the ground. These are categories of evidence that at virtually any other archaeological site of comparable age simply do not survive at all. Fabric rots. Wood decays. Bone tools crumble. Organic material of any kind, left in ordinary soil under ordinary conditions, disappears within decades or centuries at most, leaving behind nothing but faint chemical stains or vague impressions that researchers can only interpret indirectly. Windover preserved all of it, directly, physically, in condition good enough to study with the naked eye. And the full assemblage, taken together, paints a picture of these people that directly contradicts the assumption most casual observers would make about a community living 8,000 years ago. This was not a marginal, desperate population, barely clinging to survival at the edge of human capability. The demographic range of the burials, newborns to the elderly, both sexes equally present. The sustained, codified burial ritual maintained for over 1,000 years. The textile production, the tool sophistication, all of it points toward a stable, organized, genuinely thriving community of hunter-gatherer fishers living in early archaic Florida with a level of social complexity most people would never associate with a population this old. And today, after 3 full field seasons and 168 recovered individuals, only half the pond has ever been excavated. Dr. Glenn Doran himself has stated directly that only approximately half of the pond has been excavated. More cultural resources, in his own assessment, remain buried within the undisturbed peat, as well as in areas surrounding the ancient pond itself that have never been tested at all. Think about what that specific ratio actually means, laid out plainly against everything already recovered from the half that has been examined. 168 individuals, 91 preserved brains, successfully extracted ancient DNA, the oldest known woven fabric in the world, bone tools preserved in near-perfect condition, a codified burial ritual maintained for over 1,100 years, all of that from roughly half of one small pond. The other half is still down there, untouched, undisturbed, sitting in the exact same peat chemistry that preserved everything in the excavated portion so completely that a trained forensic expert initially mistook 8,000-year-old remains for a modern crime scene. Today, the Windover site is protected by the Archaeological Conservancy, the same nonprofit organization that safeguards the Galt site in Texas. The 5 wooded lots surrounding the pond sit inside the very same residential subdivision that was under construction the day Steve Vanderjagt's backhoe first struck bone. Houses stand within direct sight of the pond itself. Families live there year-round, most of them with no particular idea what is still sitting beneath the quiet, unremarkable body of water visible from their own backyards. The decision to leave the remaining half unexcavated was not made because funding ran out, or because researchers lost interest, or because anyone concluded the undisturbed portion was unlikely to hold anything significant. It was made for the exact same reason we have seen at River Bluff Cave in Missouri, at Persistence Cave in South Dakota, at Russell Cave in Alabama, and at the Galt site in Texas. The deliberate, principled recognition that future generations of researchers will carry tools, techniques, and analytical methods that nobody working today can fully anticipate, and that spending irreplaceable evidence now, simply because the technology to partially read it happens to exist already, would be a permanent, irreversible loss. That restraint is not passive. It is one of the hardest decisions a working scientist can make. To know exactly what is sitting in the ground beneath your feet, to understand with genuine, first-hand certainty how significant it is, and to choose, deliberately, not to touch it. And here is the image worth carrying away from this story, because it is genuinely unlike anything else covered in this entire series. Somewhere in the undisturbed peat at the bottom of that Florida pond, wrapped in fabric older than the pyramids, pinned beneath hand-lashed wooden stakes driven into the mud by people whose names no living person will ever know, there are human remains whose brains are almost certainly still physically intact inside their skulls. Still there, still preserved, still holding, in some physical, chemical, structural sense, the last material traces of individual lives lived 8,000 years ago, in a Florida that looked nothing like the one visible from the surface today. They have been waiting there in total silence and total darkness for 80 centuries. And the people who know exactly where they are and exactly what they represent are choosing to let them wait a little longer. In 1982, a backhoe operator turned over a rock and found a face staring back at him. Beneath that ordinary Florida pond sat 168 people, buried with genuine care, wrapped in the oldest fabric on Earth, their brains still physically intact inside their skulls after 8,000 years of undisturbed silence. A developer who could have looked the other way chose not to. An archaeologist who could have rushed the excavation chose not to. And today, the team that knows exactly what is still sitting in the undisturbed half of that pond is choosing, deliberately, to leave it where it is. The people of Windover were not kings. They were not conquerors. They were ordinary people, living ordinary lives, buried by families who loved them enough to wrap them carefully and hold them down beneath the water with their own hands. 8,000 years later, they are still exactly where they were placed. Subscribe for the next investigation.